The spiritual influences which determine an artist's career are probably of greater interest than the physical qualities he has inherited. And I have been asked to speak to you briefly of the impulses working behind my music as far as I understand them. All artists are swayed by forces uncontrolled by themselves, and in youth at any rate, whilst groping for a personal direction, they owe much to other artists, both past and present, whose work they admire. A well-known poet and critic once remarked in my hearing, "Thank God I can trace the literary genealogy of any poem I have ever read." This is true also of music. There have been few composers who have sprung, like Minerva, fully armed from the brain of Jove, and these not among the very greatest. Debussy and Chopin seem to have derived less than most from any spiritual ancestor, but even in their cases, one finds a hint of Massenet in the one, and of John Field and Bellini in the other. But now I fear that, obedient to the BBC's request, I must most reluctantly turn to my own modest part in the world's music. Nearly all my earlier work is pure and almost impersonal nature music. External nature affected me passionately, even in my early childhood. It has always been a matter of great regret to me that I was not brought up in the country, but failing that, my boyhood's home could be counted the next best thing. We had a large and beautiful garden, whilst the long rambling house certainly seemed to belong to the country rather than to a London suburb. For the window of my small study looked out upon a density of trees and shrubs, to which not a sign of a house could be seen. Another powerful and equally enduring factor was the sudden revelation to me at the age of 18 of the Celtic world, through the discovery of W.B. Yeats's long narrative poem, The Wanderings of Oisin. Thereupon I instantly became a sort of honorary Irishman, and indeed with the bestowal upon me of the Doctor of Music degree at the National University of Ireland 2 years ago, in 1947, I came very near to feeling myself to be a naturalized Erenach. A famous Irish poet once said to me, "Arnold, you have a completely Gaelic-sized mind." Under this domination, my musical style was strengthened and purged of many alien elements. In part at least, I rid myself of the sway of Wagner and Strauss, and began to write Irishly, using figures of a definitely Celtic curve, an idiom which in the end was so much second nature to me that many works of mine have been called Irish or Celtic, when I suppose them to be purely personal to the British composer Arnold Bax. Only the other day I was attacked by a young critic on the charge of my Celticism. There was not a word of consideration of the music itself, which, by the way, had no programmatic basis. It was enough that this particular journalist happened to be bored by everything Irish. These newspaper men can be a queer lot, and often make the most unwarrantable assumptions. One of my earliest works to be publicly performed was a Celtic song cycle written in 1904. A critic remarked, "At present this young man should be severely kept in the study of Debussy, a composer of whom I had never even heard at the time. His music first arrived in England in the following year." Of another work dating from 1913, a writer in an American gramophone catalogue states that one of the influences to be noted in my orchestration is that of Respighi, again an utter stranger to me 35 years ago. The poetry and prose of Yeats introduced me to the Irish fairy hierarchy and to the magnificent heroic sagas of his land. There were three different earthly paradises as conceived by the ancient Gael. One, the hollow hill; two, He-Brazil, or the land of eternal youth, situated in an enchanted island in the Atlantic, said sometimes even now to be glimpsed from the western seaboard of Eire; and three, Moimel, the pleasant plain. I wrote tone poems about all these three pagan places of bliss. In the fairy hills, the hollow hill; the garden of Fand, He-Brazil, both orchestral works; and Moimel, a piece for two pianos. Living as I did for many months, through many years, in places on the Atlantic coast, it is natural that the sea, in its many varieties of mood, entered very conspicuously into my work. Its surges may be heard not only in Fand, but also in Tintagel. in which enormous rollers may be imagined crashing upon the cliffs of Cornwall, and in some of my piano music too, written at about the same time, Winter Waters and the Sonata for Two Pianos, for instance. I think I may claim, in all modesty, that I was the first to translate the hidden island into musical terms. And all this I owed in the first place to Yeats, for his was the key that opened the gate of the Celtic wonderland, and his the finger that pointed to the magic mountain whence I was to dig nearly all that may be of value in my own art. Neither does my debt to that great man end there, for his poetry has always meant more to me than all the music of the centuries. All the days of my life I bless his name. Yet, in spite of my veneration for Yeats, I have never attempted to set any of his poetry to music. It's too good. The plain fact is that it is sacrilege to tamper with the great verse by trying to associate it with another art. Poetry has its own precise rhythms and intrinsic melody, and at its highest should be reverently let alone. In my younger days, I was a devotee of Wagner, and always longed to try my hand at music drama. In fact, I went so far as to write 2 libretti, both upon Irish themes. The first of these was a five-act blank verse play on the subject of Deirdre, and the second a folk comedy, rather in the manner of J.M. Synge. In this well-known tale, a turbulent 18th century peasant poet is ejected from a cottage where he is making a nuisance of himself by means of a ruse contrived by the woman of the house. She asks the intruder if he will take a hand in the twisting of a hempen rope, and maneuvers in such a way that as the rope gets longer, the poet, busy with his end of the rope, is by degrees back through the open door and out into the road. The house is then bolted against him. But alas, when I had finished these things, and I certainly do not claim them to be literary masterpieces, neither of them seemed to call for music. I have, I believe, no particular gift for opera, or any technical theories about it, and I doubt whether it is a medium suited to us as a nation. Benjamin Britten, in his Peter Grimes, is the only English composer who has ever shown a brilliant theatrical flair. While still very young, 17 to be precise, I came under the personal influence of Elgar. I was introduced to him by a mutual friend, well acquainted since boyhood with the great composer. This first meeting took place at Birchwood, the woodland cottage a few miles from Malvern, where Gerontius had been scored. Elgar was still sore over the fiasco attending the first performance of this work at Birmingham in the previous autumn. My friend told me, as we were returning to Malvern, that he'd been asked what were my musical ambitions. On being told that I intended to devote myself to composition, Elgar had made no comment beyond a grimly muttered, "God help him." It has been suggested that all art derives from a sickness of the soul, just as a pearl is generated by a diseased oyster. A completely happy and healthy person, maintains this pessimist, would have no need for self-expression, and would be content to laze all day in the sun like an Italian workman. Be that as it may, I think the theory holds good in regard to much of the romantic, introspective literature and music of the last 100 years. The catastrophe of 1914 certainly threw a cloud upon the imaginations of men, and bundled away dreams such as those in which I had hitherto indulged. Yet, despite the restless and somber mood of the world, or perhaps because of it, many creative artists managed to continue with their work and even gained in strength. The demon of the time seized upon us and forced us to his will. When my first symphony was performed in America, I mentioned in a program note that as far as I was aware, the harsh and stormy work was an example of pure music, unassociated with contemporary events. Whereupon a New York critic upbraided me as the quibbling Bax, and added, "Of course this music from beginning to end represents the reaction of the composer's mind to the Great War." These are deep matters, and I must admit but scarcely ever in later years have I been tempted to seek again the ivory tower of my youth, even if I could find my way there.